welcome everyone to our webinar, The Human Side of Occupancy, How Leadership, Culture, and Team Alignment Drove Providence Point to 95%. Today's session is about something we see all the time, but we don't always talk about it. What happens when you have a strong product, solid demand, and apartments that still aren't selling the way they should? We're going to walk through a real example with Providence Point, what was happening, what we uncovered, and how the team ultimately moved from under 90% to over 95%. Today, you'll hear directly from the team who lived it, what worked, what changed, and what they might do differently. Let me go ahead and introduce the team. I will start off. I am Amy Brody. I'm the Senior Vice President of Client Experience at Love & Company. My role is to work alongside leadership teams to ensure our strategies are grounded in data. We love our data, aligned with client goals, and driving meaningful performance. Amy.
I'm Amy Dukes. I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Public Relations for Baptist Senior Family. We're a small not-for-profit in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Providence Point is our life plan community.
Great. And Joan.
Hello, everyone. I'm Joan Kelly Kincaid. I'm the Director of Client Sales Strategies at Love & Company. I work alongside senior living teams across the country, including Providence Point, during what has been a period of really robust growth and change. And we look forward to sharing our experience with you today.
Great. Thanks, Joan. Thanks, Amy. Welcome to both of you. Amy, let's start with you and set the scene for us. What got you thinking, even when census was what many would consider great and be very happy with, what made you look at that and say, I wonder if there's something different we could do?
Providence Point is less than 20 years old. It is a beautiful campus, 32 acres in Pittsburgh, and we have beautiful apartments that are really large. We have up to 4,000 square feet in our patio homes. We have a lot of amenities. It's a wonderful place to live. And in Pittsburgh, we don't have a lot of life plan communities. So when our census was at 85%, it really didn't make any sense. We certainly have the market here. We have a beautiful product, but we were at a lower census. At the same time, we had decided to take one floor of our personal care and modify it into 10 new independent living apartments that offered the amenities that people were asking for. So those apartments, you can see in the pictures here, they had high-end finishes. They all had outdoor space. They were the sizes that people were looking for, but they weren't selling. We wanted to pre-sell them so people could make their modifications. And we got to the point that the construction was done and they weren't sold. So at that point, I thought, there's something going on. I'm missing something. And my CEO and CFO also said, what are you missing? So we had a really good campaign that was very successful. We had a database that was full of leads for us to work. We had a team that was working so many hours to make this happen, yet our census was still low. So my CEO and CFO said, why don't we bring in a consultant to help us? And I thought, it's never good when the CEO and CFO says, VP, you need help. So I decided to take that as the support that it was. And we looked at a couple of different agencies and chose Love & Company as our consultant. But I didn't want to wait until the assessment was over to really start working with the team. So I asked Love & Company to please send Joan on site immediately for sales coaching while the assessment was done to really help us to move forward as quickly as possible. And I'm really glad we did.
Great. Thank you, Amy. When we are on site to do an assessment at Love & Company, we look at everything. And I have to say, we were pretty surprised by what we found. This is a beautiful, well-kept, updated community with all the bells and whistles. So on the surface, it was a little bit puzzling to us. And it took a little bit more digging to see what was happening. And as that often is the case, there wasn't just one obvious thing that we could say, hey, Amy, go fix this and you're good to go. Something that we find consistently across the board is it's never just one thing. And that's really worth remembering. And that will be reinforced throughout our webinar today at how we really took a complete 360 view of the community as we do. So when we step into situations like this, we don't just look at the marketing or the leads, we look at the entire system. So we're talking about a deep dive into the residents and staff and getting their feedback on what they're seeing and feeling. We look at the product. Does it truly meet the market, what it's asking for? We look at the market and demand. Are we attracting the right prospects? And then we look at the sales process. Enter Joan. How are leads handled and converted and what's going on there? Then we also look at the team structure and the roles. Who's doing what and where time is actually being spent. The experience, what prospects feel from first touch through move in. And finally, because we love our data, we really study the data to tell us both about performance, what's going on, and behavior. And because the answer always sits at the intersection of one of these, not just one area, we kept looking. So, Amy, let's start with what the data revealed for you.
The data was extremely helpful. We were looking at almost 50 apartments that we needed to sell and sales staff who were very, very busy. So we thought we need another sales counselor. And what the data showed us is that we used benchmarks. Joan used benchmarks. Thank you, Joan, to figure out where do we compare to our peers across the country. And the benchmark showed us that we were getting the leads that we needed. But the data also showed us that we had the staff that we needed. They just weren't focusing where they needed to focus. So Joan did a comprehensive time study to say, okay, in order to have successful sales, you need to be able to spend time in the selling zone. That's making phone calls, that's building relationships, that's doing tours. And what we really found was that our sales staff had gotten a little off track by getting out of the selling zone, which is so easy to do. It's so easy to think, I have a relationship with these prospects and they need this. And yeah, technically it's someone else's job to do this, but it'll take me 5 minutes. And that 5 minutes needs follow-up that's 10 minutes. And that follow-up needs 2 hours. And by the end of the week, you're spending half of the time that you should be in the selling zone. So what the data showed us was what the human transition, what was happening with the humans on the team, which was they were starting to get off track. And that left other people on the team who should be doing those jobs not being able to fulfill what they're supposed to be doing as effectively as possible. So one of the things we really looked at because of the data was how can we make sure that people are able to spend the time that they need to in the jobs that they need to be doing. So we did some transitioning with job descriptions and really built the team so that they trusted each other so we could make those handoffs. The other thing that the data, sorry,
go ahead.
I was going to say the other thing the data showed us is through the surveys with the residents and the staff, we saw that everyone was a little challenged by the idea of these new apartments in Franklin Court because it's change and change is hard. So what we really needed to do also was internal PR to help our staff and residents get behind Franklin Court because 50% of our sales last year were from resident referrals. So if our residents aren't suggesting Franklin Court, then their friends aren't considering it.
Wow, thank you, Amy. You talked a lot about time in the selling zone. Joan, what were you seeing on site that kind of reinforced what Amy was talking about there?
You're using that word, and so did the other Amy use the word reinforce. And that's what the data brought to life. As I said earlier, the data, the day in the life of the team, it all was in sync. It all said the same thing. They were very dedicated. They were doing everything. They were managing the move-in process and probably handling details that could have been supported by others. That's what we found. So while they were busy all day, every day, very little of their time, and Amy just showed us how we can drift, and we see that a lot. It's normal. Everyone does it. The idea is to capture it and stop it. And that's what they were doing. That very little of their time was being spent selling in that what we call a selling zone. That was the disconnect. It wasn't an issue that they were doing it. It was the fact that we had to get control of time and be consistent.
I got to say, Joni, who amongst us hasn't had that happen? It's, oh, I'll just do that real quick. And then that, and then it rolls into days and weeks. And
Yes.
so it's a tendency to drift that way. Amy, did the assessment change your perspective on the census challenge?
It really did. It reinforced and gave me confidence that our product is spectacular and that we shouldn't have a census challenge. But it also helped me to see how a way where we could move forward with it. And I think that that boost in confidence was really helpful in having Joan on site so much to get to know the staff, not just in the sales and marketing department, but across the campus, really helped to build a relationship with her, and that helped us to move forward change. But I think that when we looked at the data and saw that there's no reason that these Franklin Court apartments shouldn't be selling, we really had to figure out, well, what can we do to change the perception of Franklin Court so that more people are on board with it being a great product? And if we can show the site plan, I can talk a little bit about what we found. So this is a site plan of Providence Point. We have 32 acres and we have apartments and patio homes. If you look on the left side of the screen, the two yellow buildings that are one on top of the other, Adams and Madison Tower, and then lower center, the Hamilton Tower, those were our original independent living apartments. And that purplish, the 500 building space is our large commons area. So we have restaurants in that area. We have activity space, card rooms, community space, a bank, movie theater, all of it's there. If you go up a little bit to that reddish building, that's where our wellness area is. So that's our fitness center and our pool and our salon and spa. And when we opened Franklin Court, that's the top center. So that's the building that's green with yellow edging. Excuse me. So Franklin Court, what I heard and what Joan and Amy heard in the assessment from staff and residents is, well, Franklin Court is just so far away. And I said, it is not far away. But I kept hearing that it's so far away. So I got one of those wheels on a stick that you measure with. And I went to the end of Franklin Court and measured the different distance, in all of our commons areas. And then I went to the three original towers and did the same thing. And Franklin Court was not further. Proof is in the numbers, Franklin Court's not further. But people still didn't believe it. It was a perception issue. So, in working with Joan and our CEO and our executive director and our dining services, we said, how can we make this all one? And what we found was a space near that 200 at the end of the red, a space where we could put in a coffee shop, something very simple, high-end coffee, local baked goods, to draw people down to that area. And then we created a meeting space down there so people could connect in that area. And now it feels like it's all part of the same community.
And I have to say, Amy, have a drink of water. I have
Sorry.
to say that I was there, and so was Joan for part of that assessment. And the hallway that we were seeing was just this long, bland hallway. And we could see that. That really stood out to us. Like, wow, nobody wants to walk through here to go there. It just doesn't feel connected. So, as you showed on your map, and I can't believe you did it. You got one of those wheelie things that
Yeah,
measures. That's the official term for it, Amy.
it really is.
Yeah. You measured that and found out, with data, hey, you guys, it's not that far, um, that different in distance. So it was very interesting from that standpoint. Joan, from a sales perspective, how did that shift things for you?
Well, it definitely showed us that nothing was wrong with this product. What we needed to do was shift how we thought about the product. It's perception, as Amy said, and it was about how we were working. So instead of changing the goal, we focused on time and being consistent. We didn't need to do everything perfectly. We just needed to make sure that we were doing the right things by the right people consistently, so that everyone across the team felt like they were clear on their path. And that made a lot of difference. Amy, it required that we shifted roles. Amy Dukes alluded to that earlier. We shifted how time was used. And as she just noted, we shifted how space was used. And all of that worked together. And that meant that we started to see thinking change. And that's ultimately, I believe, what shifted occupancy, what grew occupancy. Everyone started thinking about this totally differently.
And I think that's key. You guys appropriately named this the human part of selling. And the data was so helpful in telling us what we needed to do, but it was the coaching and the adjusting perceptions and expectations and really being consistent with it that got us to the point of being more successful.
Thank you, Amy. I've heard you both mention the human factor several times. Joan, what were the biggest challenges that you saw with how the team was operating?
What became clear from the assessment and from working with them is that we had really strong responsibility among the team, but the responsibility was in the wrong place. And what we saw, and we've mentioned this now several times, they were carrying too much of several processes that they shouldn't have been, that could have been better managed by other team members. And it pulled them out of selling. And when that happens, sales starts to get isolated, the move-in process starts to get isolated, and everything becomes rather inconsistent. And so what we really found is we heard things like the following. Instead of saying this is the counselor's job to do whatever, we started hearing this is a team effort. We'll get there. We're not there yet, but together we'll get there. And that meant that everybody recognized the process was shifting. It was more defined. Everyone understood it and agreed to it. And while everyone stayed in their own lane, they understood where their paths merged. And they did it without friction. It didn't mean it was always happy and easy, but they kept their eye on the future and they got where they wanted to be. And they did that with consistency and and being aware of how they use their time.
Thanks, Joan. You mentioned so many times the people and the shifts that happen, and I would imagine that's hard. Change is hard, let alone you're really talking about people. But
Yeah.
I know that you were able to really dig in and get to know everybody, so you could help make sense of why this would make sense. Amy, how did that show up from your perspective as a leader?
I think we had the opportunity that so many times we don't take advantage of, to allow the special skills of our staff to shine. So what we see now are the people who are in those support roles have special skills that make them very successful in those roles. But because we didn't have trust in the team, because people were trying to do too much, they didn't have the opportunity to really shine in those roles. And now I see much more confidence in my team, in their ability to be a really strong, important layer of what we do, but also just in their everyday work, they're shining in what they do. And I'm getting feedback from our residents who are moving in saying, wow, that options move-in coordinator is amazing. He made this process so much easier. Oh, the marketing coordinator, she's so welcoming, and I know I can take questions to her. And ultimately, what we see is that the experience of moving into Providence Point is now a much more welcoming experience. When the sales counselor was doing everything, people were isolated and that being their only point of contact. But now that we have things set up in a much more user-friendly way where people are doing what they're good at, our sales counselors are able to hand off their prospects before they move in to the right people. And so before residents move in, they're now building relationships with several different departments. So by the time they move in, they feel like they have a number of people to go to if they have questions instead of just one.
That's interesting. I myself worked in a community and I know it was always hard to hand off. You get close to these people, it's that human factor, and you want to make sure that they're okay and do everything you can for them. But that was really a turning point for you all. What ultimately do you think made the biggest difference in getting you to 95%?
That's a tough question. It was just so many things. I think the data helped to drive us in the right direction, and we'd never let go of the data. It's important to continue to show the team the data, to show them the progress they're making so that they realize that the differences are making a difference in the outcome. But I think what really changed things was empowering people to do their jobs and just their jobs, and empowering them to support each other in moving everything forward.
Joan, what role did coaching play in that shift?
Well, it was about helping them understand how things work and why it matters. There was, excuse me, there were and there are a mix of experience levels on this team. So coaching did matter, but not in the traditional sense. It wasn't about telling them what to do. It's what I just said, helping us all understand what matters, how it works, and why it's worth repeating. And what Amy just said about the data was part of that. It reinforced understanding, and that helped to reinforce consistency. We built good habits. And with that, our focus was on helping the counselors focus on how they use their time while at the same time building confidence in the rest of the team that was around them to support them so they could let go. And when that happened, we could see that trust was growing and people didn't need to do things that could be better done by someone else. And that's when we really started to see change.
Wow. So, Amy Dukes, what changes did you notice first that Joan is referencing?
Mhm.
I think what I noticed first was that people, our staff, started to use different language. They started to sound like Joan. And it was really helpful because what it told me was they were really internalizing what the coaching was giving them, but they were also looking at the data and seeing where it was leading. I can say with confidence at the very beginning of this process, we would look at the numbers and say, oh, that's not good. But we couldn't say, well, here's what we need to do exactly in order to get to where we need to be. By looking at the data and talking about it so regularly, the team now takes the lead and they sit down and they say, okay, well, if we want to get to 96% by this date, then we need this many 1K deposits by this date. And we need to hold people to the timeline in the contract. And, they're really looking at what every change means to the future. And I really think that's the biggest change that I see is how they're interpreting all of that and looking to the future with it.
Amy,
Wow.
what you just said, if I could comment, I agree with you. It was a big shift from a mindset where people appeared to think they didn't have control over what was happening
Right.
with Franklin Court, right? To
Hmm.
one where they said, well, here's where we're at. What are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
And I think that that was a culture shift. It was impacted by you, by the other leadership, and all the things we've already discussed today. But it really was a shift in looking at things, looking at numbers and knowing that they told a story, and then saying, okay, what do I do with this? Because it's up to me to do something about it. And that ownership is really not rare. When people feel empowered and they understand, they take ownership of it. And I think that that's what your team did.
Yeah, so it's very exciting to hear the changes that came about, and this is a just an hour webinar, and it certainly took more than an hour to get there. Let's fast forward a little bit to now and today, and I'm going to ask each of you this question, and I'll start with you, Joan. But what's different about the team today?
Their focus. The counselors spend their time where it matters most, as do all of the other team members. Their roles are clean and clear to them. They collaborate, and there's a shared understanding across the team that occupancy isn't one person's responsibility, it's all of theirs. And I believe that's what makes this success sustainable.
And I think piggybacking off what Joan was saying a little bit ago, we had a shift from the idea that, well, that's the way we've always done it, so we're going to continue to do it that way, to a team who's now saying, well, things have changed. We're going to have to build the waiting list. We need to look at this policy and maybe we adjust this, and really taking that initiative to not just say, well, we always did it this way, so we'll do it, to say, we always did it this way, but the market is changing and we need to change with it, and really taking responsibility.
That's exciting. Amy, I have to go back and comment in the very beginning. You were talking about how your CEO and some of the leadership team had come to you, and that can be intimidating, as you said. And it's impressive the way you went from that, decided to take that as, hey, I'm going to do this. This is a resource for me. Talk a little bit more about that, internalizing that, and then sharing that and getting the team on board with that.
It was really challenging. I had to get over my own reaction to it and look at it as an opportunity. But it really became even more of an opportunity because this came from the CEO and CFO. When we went through this process and came up with ideas like the coffee shop to change this, they were more likely to say yes because they had been engaged from the beginning of this whole process. So that was very helpful. But to get the team on board was a little challenging because they felt the same way. They felt like it was leadership saying that they weren't doing a good enough job. And I think the coaching and the data really helped to shift that, to say, look, yes, you've been working really hard. Look at how you've been spending your time. You're not you're not just sitting and twiddling your thumbs. You're working hard every hour of the day. But is that how you should be spending your time? And really acknowledging the work that they did, but talking about how we can shift. And it was very difficult. But once they started to see that if we did shift and allow other people to do their jobs, then we actually had more time to do the things that we're very confident in. And then we have more success. So it was a slow process. And it took a lot of meetings and a lot of coaching and a lot of hair pulling, not of each other, just of ourselves. Um, and then we got to the point, we got over the hump, and the changes, we started to be more comfortable with the changes, and we started to see results.
Joan, how did you, going on site with a team, and knowing how they were feeling, at least initially, and I know now they say you're like family and you practically live there. So, but how did you go about that human factor of taking that into consideration and going in and being helpful, and guide and coach these very successful right? We all said that the census was high, very successful sales team. But yet there was still something we were trying to noodle through. Talk to me about how you made that happen.
I believe it's really important to focus on what works and capitalize on that. And as I said earlier, we had team members who were skilled in various areas, but in different ways. So we explored what worked. We explored everything they brought to the table that was already strong and looked at how we could refine that and increase the strength of it. And in those discussions, while we acknowledged what worked, we also acknowledged where our gaps were. And that's what led to the awareness of how we were using our time. And I think that it also led to awareness that we weren't there to fix problems. We were there to celebrate what worked and build on that and create opportunities that would bring more success. And it wasn't that anybody was doing things wrong. We just needed to figure out what the things were that we needed to do more of. I think I said that grammatically correct. And I do believe that's a good way to come out of the gate. Uh, I'm not comfortable going in telling people we're here to fix things. I think it's more important to go in and listen and ask the right questions. And this team had a lot to share. They had a lot to say, and they had a lot of good answers. And together, we figured this out.
I love how this story unfolded in talking with you all and hearing from start to finish what took place. I'm going to wrap up with some of the key points that I heard today, and please jump in, Joan or Amy, if I miss anything, because I want to make sure that we give all of Amy's peers out there the secret to this particular success. So the data showed us what was happening and that it would require being on site and working together to help us understand why, to get to that human part. Wasn't a marketing issue. It was about people and how each person approached and managed processes that affected everyone on the entire team. The counselors were overextended. Time in the selling zone was limited, and sales were happening in isolation rather than across the whole team. So the focus shifted, results were impacted because of clear alignment with leadership right from the start. And as each of the next steps occurred, Amy, you touched on that many times, that it was revisiting it many times with many of the staff throughout the community. Roles were rebalanced across people and teams. This created time for the marketing counselors to do the right things they needed to do, stay in the selling zone, and to focus on their own critical work, which in turn, Amy, you touched on this, really gave them the feeling of satisfaction. They were doing what they're there to do. And there's a lot of enjoyment in that. And it meant that all team members, from counselors to data specialists to move-in support, were each a part of the process and contributed to the success. And I think what this all means is that trust was established across the team and impacted the experience of every prospect that visited and ultimately increased your occupancy.
Mhm.
Amy, for our group here today, what's your senses at today?
As of yesterday, and we did have someone
Okay.
move in yesterday, so it may be higher today.
Huh?
We are at 95.8%.
Congratulations.
Thank
That's
you.
very big accomplishment.
It is.
What would you say, or what would you want your peers to walk away with from this experience?
I think it's important to remember that our market is changing. The people who we serve are changing, and technology changes how people learn about long term living and retirement communities and everything every day. So it's important to always look at those policies and processes and update them and talk to the team about what's working and what's not. I've worked in the past in highly regulated areas where you can't just make changes. We're in sales and marketing. We can adjust our policies and procedures anytime that it makes sense. Don't get stuck with this is how we've always done it, or this is what the policy says, and really look at whether those things need changed and make it a team affair to really look at the big picture and okay, if we make this change, how's that going to affect everything else? But really look at how the market is shifting and learn from what your sales counselors and your staff and your data specialists and everyone are telling you.
I love that. All right, before we go into questions, and we're getting a lot of them, so we'll be excited to have a Q&A session here. But I'm going to start with Joan, and I'm asking each of you to give, and this is hard, I'm going to limit you to one sentence, maybe two. What's your key takeaway for everyone today?
Protect time in the selling zone. That's where occupancy lives.
Amy, what is your key takeaway?
Change is difficult. You can utilize the data, but you do have to take into account the human factor and manage change with the human beings you're working with.
I love it. So it goes right in, flows into a question that we have here, and I'm going to dive right in. And I believe that it's going to be aimed at you, Joan. What type of tasks were taking the sales team out of the selling zone?
Well, it depends on the day, right, Amy Dukes?
Mm-hmm.
When events were being planned, they were instead of being part of that initial discussion, they were buried in the details of event planning. When move-ins were occurring, as people made commitments and made that initial deposit and then became 10% depositors, they were doing administrative tasks. They were doing paperwork that was better managed by other people. And then options and upgrades took a lot of time, and as did the move-in process, working with building services, working with vendors, looking at timeline and movers and stagers. All of that took a lot of time, and the sales counselors, the marketing counselors, tended to try to do some or all of it.
Great, thank you. Another question here, and this one's going to come to you, Amy. And I love the way it's worded. I think it was brilliant that you really did measure the actual distance. One, what in the world made you think to do that? And two, how much did that reality change your thinking as to what the real problem was?
I decided to do it just out of frustration because I just knew it wasn't further and I wanted the numbers to show it. But what it really did was it opened my eyes to the fact that the issue wasn't the distance, that the issue went far beyond that. It was the change and it was the perception. And that opened us up to many different ideas on how to bring more people into that Franklin Court area. So it started out as just frustration, but it actually ended up being a good use of my time.
Great. Next question. How long did it take for you to establish and operationalize the high-end coffee shop that drew current residents over to the perceived far area?
It didn't take that long because we have an amazing environmental services team who modified the area to be appropriate for a coffee shop. And then we have a wonderful dining partner in Cura, and they were on board with the idea of a high-end coffee shop. They had the relationship with La Colombe, and they really made it happen. The thing that took the longest was getting the health department permit. That took us months. So we were ready to go several months before we even opened. But it only took maybe 3 or 4 months for our environmental services and dining team to make it happen. And then once we got the permit, we were up and running and did some samples and got people hooked. And now it is a successful coffee shop.
That it is. I've had the coffee. Another question here, looking to you, Joan, I believe. How was the data collected to determine where the sales counselors were spending their time?
Initially, during the assessment, we want to rely on what's in the database. But one of the things that we found was that the team wasn't consistently using the database. And as you know, Amy, that's pretty normal. We see that, and that's something that is able to be fixed. So we started off with benchmarks, with national benchmarks that we trust and use often, and then started to change the way we use the database. And we were able to use their actual day-to-day work. And every month we would look at that. We updated it actually on a weekly basis and looked at projections for what it meant and worked with the team to say, this looks like the direction we're going in. We projected and knew what our attrition would be. And so we worked backwards from there, knowing what our goals were, that we then understood what it meant in terms of the activities we needed to do. What I'd like to share with everyone is that as the team improved the way they used time, the data changed. We saw that they actually had to make less call outs because they had more time to plan and think, and they were getting more call-ins from existing leads as a result. So that was all in the database, and it was able to provide motivation for them. They were able to say, I understand why that's working, and I'm going to do more of it. And the database continued to give us that validation.
I think that that data really helped to convince our sales counselors to let go of those additional tasks that they were taking on
Yes.
because they could see that, well, I have this many move-ins this month, which means I'm spending this much time on it. So I'm not making as many phone calls. So next month I have fewer deposits. And it really did illustrate the cause and effect. And if you spend more time here and let someone else take care of that extra stuff, then you're going to be more successful.
Great, thank you. We have another question here that might hint toward return on investment. I don't know. The question is, was this cafe staffed by the community, volunteers, or residents? Sometimes not-for-profit communities are challenged to use paid resources despite the improvement that was felt afterward.
That is a really good question. The cafe has limited hours, the coffee shop, so it's staffed by one full-time staff member. So when we're looking at the ROI on it, we're counting it against one FTE. And we look every week to make sure that we're covering our costs and making something. So it was staffed by a staff member, and we are closely measuring that investment to make sure that it's successful.
Thank you, Amy. Another question, did this require hiring more people, one you just spoke of, or I think to you, Joan, just splitting duties better and clear?
Yes, what we did is we looked at Amy's team and we looked at the budget she had for her team. And we agreed when we understood the data that we just needed to reallocate time and dollars differently. And so what it meant was rewriting one of the job descriptions so that we could capitalize on strengths that were on the team in a more direct, focused way. And it did let us bring in another person that was already in the budget but wasn't being used. And that let us then have a different person to take care of data management and event planning and that sort of thing. The initial thought, and Amy can speak to this, the initial thought was use those dollars for a third salesperson. But what we all agreed after really taking a look at the situation, we needed no more salespeople. We needed better planning and focus. Amy, do you want to comment on that further?
Yes, it's very interesting. We did have money allocated in the budget for an additional position. And when we tried to fill it, it was not successful because the team would not let go of jobs and they did not trust the new person. But by going through this process, we were able to get people focused on the jobs they should be doing, which allowed us then to fill that position that had become vacant with someone who they then trusted. we had built more trust among the team, and it made this position successful.
Well, I think that kind of leads into this next question for Joan and Amy. You both mentioned the human factor many times. How do you know what that is? At my community, we stress relationships and being real, and the team is good at it, but we are stuck at 88%.
Amy, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think when we looked at the data, that gave us a hint of what the human issue was that we needed to address. And by looking at the data and what it meant, Joan and I spent a lot of time together with other leadership, other leaders in this community to really talk about, okay, if the data says this, what does it look like? What do we need to do to adjust the human factor, to help with change management? And I think a lot of it is, even with relational people, which is who should be in sales, definitely you should be a people person to be in marketing. We still need to adjust how we're managing any new leads because the lead base is changing. Our population is changing. We're shifting to clients who are coming in and they know more, and we have to respect that. So it does adjust the time then that you spend with each prospect.
Yeah, and it's a great question, and it's a great distinction to make because this is about relationships. But as you were saying, those relationships have evolved. We have hyper-informed prospects today. They come in knowing a lot, and what they're looking for literally is a human connection. They're looking to be in a place that feels like home. And if that were all it was, there are good people all over the country doing these jobs. If that were all it was, that would be wonderful. But it takes more than that. It takes the structure and process that we were talking about earlier too, and that just takes some thinking and planning and attentiveness to it. So it's the relationships as well as the attention to structure and process that work hand in hand to kind of move the ball.
Thank you both. I'm going to switch gears a little to a question and that's actually appeared a couple times. I think probably we all can relate. Um, how did you get the sales team to use the database more to track time and activities?
Well, it we knew that we knew we had people that had deep experience and a lot of skills. And what Amy and I started to do was to track the data for our own edification. We said, we want to know where this is going. We want to know what the cause and effect is, as she said earlier. And as we came to understand that more, we made sure we shared it with the team so that they could see how we were thinking. And that led us to questions, that led us to conversations, and that led them to want to understand the data further themselves. And it really was a trial by fire. They had to see that the data could show them that there was a way to spend their time that really wasn't just throwing everything at the wall, but they could become focused and target the people they need to talk to about a particular product, for example, and not just reach out to everyone because they were working as hard as they could. And when they started to understand that they could work smarter and not harder, the data and the CRM started to become really valuable to them.
I have always been a believer that if it's not documented, it didn't happen. And that is something I made clear from the time I started here. And when Joan came on, she said, you know, your UPS policy is really loose. You know, when I've worked in other communities, the UPS policy was very different. And so what we had was a policy that if you're assigned to this client, even if you haven't talked to them in a long time, they remain your lead. And Joan said, that's not efficient. So we changed it so that if you have a lead and you haven't spoken to them it was 3 to 6 months when we started this, Joan,
Mhm.
and they call in or a new referral comes in for them, it gets assigned to whoever is next up. And that really drove home the need for them to document things if they wanted to retain their leads. And so we eventually got to the point where they looked at the data and said, well, we can't track data efficiently if I don't put this in. But it did start there in saying, well, if you don't document it, it didn't happen, which means that's not your lead anymore. So all of the work that you've put in previously is no longer benefiting you. And that was harsh and it was a difficult change for us, but I think it really helped people to see the value in that documentation.
I like that. Just brought everybody on board, going back to that understanding the why and seeing what works. So for this next question, Joan, I'm laughing because it's going to give you a chance to do your favorite answer. What is the benchmark ratio of number of salespeople to depositor or prospects?
Wow.
As they
Okay.
say in many Quaker communities.
It depends. Yeah. It depends. Well, in an independent living life plan community with a relatively seasoned salesperson, I would expect to see at least two deposits that lead to two move-ins each month. And sometimes we'll see three. It depends on availability. At Providence Point, that's shifting right now. And it's going to not be, as Amy and I refer to it, when you have a lot of open availability, the move-in gate, if you will, is controlled by the sales team. But now that they have very little availability, none really, the move-in gate is controlled by building services, by turnover teams. So it changes that number. That's why we say it depends. But most of the time, when there's occupancy to be built, I like to see each person getting two, maybe three deposits every month.
Thank you, Joan. I'm looking at the time. I promised I would keep this within the time limits. I see some more questions. I want to let everybody know we're going to put up a slide that you can reach out to any of us directly with more questions or give us a call. We're happy to discuss it further. We could probably talk all day about this. But I know just by the sheer number of questions that we have here, we have a very interested audience. I thank everybody for joining us today and listening to this wonderful success story at Providence Point. Thank you, Joan, for being here today. And Amy Dukes, thank you very much for joining us. Everyone, have a nice day.
Thank you.